A man is living among the tombs. People have tried to restrain him, but the restraints do not hold. He cries out, injures himself, and lives cut off from ordinary human life. Then Jesus arrives. Mark does not leave the cause vague. The man is described as having an unclean spirit. Jesus addresses that spirit directly. The spirit speaks, recognizes him, and when Jesus asks its name, the answer is one of the most famous lines in the Gospels. "My name is Legion, for we are many." That sounds like the perfect place to begin a list of evil spirits in the Bible. We have a supernatural being, a name, a dramatic encounter, and a clear act of deliverance. But the closer you read Mark 5, the less it behaves like the demon charts many Christians have seen online. Mark calls the hostile presence an unclean spirit. Then the same episode uses demon language. Legion tells us there are many, but it does not give us a rank, a species, or a complete hierarchy. And by the end of the story, Mark is not teaching us how to catalog the spirits. He is showing us what Jesus has done for the man. So before we ask, how many evil spirits are in the Bible, we need a more basic question. What actually qualifies something as a biblical evil spirit? And when Scripture uses expressions like evil spirit, unclean spirit, lying spirit, spirit of divination, or spirit of fear, how certain can we be that those phrases describe the same kind of personal being? The goal is not to explain away the supernatural. Scripture will not let us do that. The goal is to separate what the text clearly identifies from what we infer, what Christians debate, and what later traditions sometimes add. Mark 5 gives us the first test. The first thing Mark 5 establishes is easy to miss because the story is so dramatic. The hostile spiritual agency is not ambiguous. Jesus is not confronting a bad mood, a metaphor, or an impersonal force in the narrative. The Spirit speaks. It recognizes Jesus. It responds to his command. The story presents personal hostile agency as part of what is happening to this man. Any careful discussion of evil spirits has to begin there. Biblical restraint does not mean biblical skepticism. Some passages are very clear that a hostile spiritual being is involved. But this clear case immediately creates another problem. Mark first describes the man as having an unclean spirit. Jesus commands the unclean spirit to come out. Yet as the scene unfolds, Mark also speaks of demons. The labels overlap inside the same encounter. That does not mean every use of the word spirit everywhere in Scripture means demon. It means that, at least here, unclean spirit and demon language refer to the same hostile spiritual reality. So if someone builds two completely separate species called demons and unclean spirits, Mark 5 itself pushes back. Then comes the name, Legion. It is easy to hear that word and immediately want more information. How many were there exactly? Does Legion describe a rank? Is this a class of spirit? Mark gives us one answer directly. We are many. That is what the name clearly establishes. Plurality. The text does not turn Legion into a permanent rank or use the Roman military image to give us an exact theological number. And there is a detail that matters more than the count. The spirits are not presented as Jesus' equals. They plead with him. By the time the townspeople return, the man who had been living among the tombs is sitting there, clothed and in his right mind. The narrative moves from domination to restoration, from the spirit's speech to the man's future testimony. So the first discovery is already more precise than a demon list. Scripture clearly portrays personal hostile spirits. Different labels can overlap, but even one of the clearest demon stories in the Bible gives us less taxonomy than later readers often want. That matters even more when we move into passages that are harder to classify. The Old Testament does contain explicit demon language. Deuteronomy 32 says that Israel sacrificed to demons and not to God. Psalm 106 uses the same rare Hebrew term in a similar setting of pagan sacrifice. So it would be wrong to say the Old Testament never speaks of demons. But that makes Saul's story in 1 Samuel 16 more important. After Saul is rejected as king, the Spirit of the Lord departs from him, and the text says that an evil or harmful spirit from the Lord torments him. The phrase sounds simple in English. Evil spirit. It is tempting to place Saul immediately into the same category as the man in Mark 5, but the passage does not make that identification for us. It does not use the Old Testament's explicit demon term. It does not call Saul demon-possessed, and the phrase from the Lord forces the reader to deal with divine sovereignty inside the story. The narrative still treats the spirit as real and harmful. The uncertainty is about classification, not whether the episode matters, and the surrounding story keeps that episode connected to Saul's rejected kingship and David's rise. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon David, while Saul's story moves in the opposite direction. Calling Saul simply demon-possessed sounds more specific, but it actually says more than the text does. Then 1 Kings 22 sharpens the problem. The prophet Micaiah describes a heavenly vision. A spirit comes forward and offers to entice King Ahab. When asked how, the spirit says it will become a lying spirit in the mouths of Ahab's prophets. What does lying spirit mean there? The text clearly presents a spirit agent involved in deception, but it does not tell us that the being's species is lying spirit. It does not identify the spirit as Satan, and it does not create a permanent demon class whose official function is lying. The lying describes what the spirit does in this scene. And the stakes are not abstract. Ahab is deciding whether to go to battle, surrounded by prophets telling him what he wants to hear. Micaiah's vision exposes the deception around a decision that will end in Ahab's death. That is why the wording matters. The passage gives us a real spirit agent and a real act of deception. What it does not give us is permission to turn that assignment into a permanent species. Modern demon teaching can move in the opposite direction. A biblical phrase describes an action or condition, and the phrase becomes the name of a spiritual category. But a role in one passage is not automatically a taxonomy. Acts 16 gives us an even more striking test because the wording itself sounds like a supernatural label. Paul and Silas are in Philippi when they encounter a slave girl who brings her owners money through fortune-telling. Luke says she has what the Greek text calls a pneuma pythona, commonly translated as a spirit of divination. The Python language belonged to the Greco-Roman world of divination and was associated with the Python tradition connected with Delphi. That background helps explain how the phrase would have sounded in its ancient setting. And Luke is not vague about whether a personal spirit is involved. Paul commands the spirit to come out of her, and it does. The consequence makes the human stakes clearer. Once the spirit is gone, the girl's owners realize that their hope of profit is gone too. The conflict that follows is not only about a strange supernatural event, it is also about a person whose spiritual condition had been turned into someone else's business. So this is not a case where historical context explains the supernatural away. But context also gives us a boundary. Acts tells us about this woman, this divinatory setting, and this spirit. It does not give us a universal modern category called the Python spirit, with a standardized list of behaviors that can be diagnosed in people today. Context clarifies the biblical claim. It does not authorize us to make the claim larger. That makes one of the most familiar Christian phrases a useful testing. 2 Timothy 1-7 is often quoted from translations that say, God has not given us a spirit of fear. That wording has sometimes been turned into the idea of a personal spirit of fear, as though Paul were naming a demon. But in the immediate context, Paul contrasts fear or timidity with power, love, and self-control. The passage does not identify a hostile personal being, so 2 Timothy 1-7 by itself does not establish a demon called the spirit of fear. That is a narrow claim. It does not mean fear can never have a spiritual dimension. It does not mean evil spirits never influence people. It means this verse does not prove the existence of a named demon simply because some English translations use the phrase spirit of fear. At this point, though, the correction can go too far. If some spirit language does not name a demon, perhaps Christians have simply spiritualized ordinary human suffering. Maybe references to spirits connected with sickness or affliction should also be treated as figures of speech. Luke 13 will not let us make that move. Jesus encounters a woman who has been disabled for 18 years. Luke describes her as having a disabling spirit. Later, Jesus says that Satan had bound her for those 18 years. In this particular story, the connection between physical affliction and hostile spiritual agency is part of the narrative itself. That does not mean every illness is demonic. Luke 13 does not allow that universal conclusion, but it also means we cannot build a method that assumes spiritual causation is never real simply because some modern claims are careless. The biblical text forces us to hold both truths together. Some spirit language does not identify a demon. Some passages clearly do describe hostile spiritual agency, so the answer cannot be as simple as spirit means demon, and it cannot be spirit language is only symbolic. Maybe the categories become clearer if we go deeper and ask where demons come from. That brings us to one of the most common claims in Christian demonology. Demons are fallen angels. The Bible unquestionably speaks about sinful angels. 2 Peter 2 says that God did not spare angels when they sinned. Jude speaks of angels who did not remain within their proper position and are kept for judgment. Those are real texts about rebellious angels. But neither passage simply says, these are demons. That distinction matters. There are theological models that connect demons with rebellious angels. Genesis 6 and later Jewish traditions are often brought into that discussion. Some Second Temple Jewish writings developed much more elaborate accounts of evil spirits and their origins than the Hebrew Bible itself gives us. That background can help explain the world in which later Jewish and Christian discussions of demons developed. But background is not the same thing as biblical definition. 2 Peter says angels. Jude says angels. If we say, therefore demons are fallen angels, we have taken an interpretive step beyond the explicit wording. That step may be argued for. It may fit a larger theological system, but it still needs to be labeled as interpretation, rather than presented as something those verses directly state. By now, enough different cases are on the table to see the pattern. Mark 5 gives us unmistakable personal hostile spirits, and Revelation 16 can explicitly describe unclean spirits as demonic spirits. At the other end, 2 Timothy 1-7 gives us spirit language, without identifying a hostile personal being. Between those points sit harder cases like Saul, Micaiah, Acts 16, and the fallen angels question. They are not contradictory. They simply do not all give us the same kind or amount of information. That is the central pattern. The Bible gives us more certainty about the reality, hostility, and defeat of evil spirits than it gives us about a complete taxonomy of their names, origins, species, and specialized functions. So instead of forcing every passage into one flat list, it is more responsible to think in levels of certainty. At the clearest level are passages that explicitly present personal hostile spiritual beings. Mark 5 belongs here. Revelation 16 belongs here too when it directly identifies its unclean spirits as demonic spirits. Then there are cases where hostile spiritual association is strongly supported without giving us a complete identity chart. 1 Timothy 4, for example, places deceiving spirits alongside teachings of demons, strongly linking the two without creating a new species called deceiving spirits. Then there are qualified or disputed cases. Saul's harmful spirit is genuinely part of the narrative, but calling it a demon requires more than the English phrase evil spirit. The fallen angels in 2 Peter and Jude are real rebellious spiritual beings, but identifying them directly with demons requires a further theological argument. And finally, there are claims that are unsupported as distinct demon categories, even when the wording sounds spiritual. 2 Timothy 1-7 does not become evidence for a named demon merely because a translation contains the phrase spirit of fear. This framework is not another inspired hierarchy. The Bible does not give us 4 official boxes. It is simply a way of letting our confidence rise or fall with the evidence a passage actually gives us. That does not make Scripture less supernatural. It keeps us from giving biblical authority to classifications the text itself does not establish. And that matters because spiritual labels do not stay inside Bible studies. They get applied to real people. Suppose someone says, "You are dealing with a spirit of fear," or "That pattern is the Python spirit." The label may be offered sincerely. It may even be attached to a Bible verse, and because the language sounds biblical, questioning the label can feel like questioning spiritual warfare itself. But those are different questions. A biblical response is not to laugh at the possibility of spiritual evil. The passages we have examined will not allow that. Neither is the biblical response to accept a diagnosis merely because it borrows biblical words. Take spirit of fear. The first question is whether the verse being cited actually identifies a personal hostile being. If it does not, then the claim has already moved beyond that verse and needs other evidence. The same is true of the Python spirit. Acts 16 really does describe a spirit connected with divination, but moving from that ancient scene to a modern checklist of personality traits, relationship problems, or spiritual symptoms is another step. The person making that step has to show where Scripture authorizes it. So when a supernatural claim is made, ask, does the passage actually describe a personal spiritual agent? What does the immediate context say that spirit is doing? Do related passages clarify the terminology? Is the proposed category explicit, strongly supported, genuinely disputed, or mainly traditional? And if the claim is being applied to someone today, Does Scripture actually justify using that passage to diagnose that person's fear, illness, addiction, intrusive thoughts, conflict, or spiritual dryness as the activity of a particular demon? Video like this cannot tell someone that their anxiety is demonic. It cannot tell someone that a medical condition is caused by an evil spirit. It cannot identify a demon behind another person's behavior. That is not skepticism. It is refusing to claim knowledge we do not have. The goal of discernment is not to become less serious about Scripture. It is to become more careful with it. And once we return to Mark 5, that care changes what stands out in the story. The spirits are dramatic. Their name is memorable. Their number is frightening. But Mark does not end by teaching us how to map them. He shows us the man. The person who had lived among the tombs is sitting there. The people who knew what he had been like now see him restored. And when he wants to go with Jesus, Jesus gives him something else to do. Go home and tell his people how much the Lord has done for him. The story that began with an unclean spirit ends with testimony. That does not make demonology irrelevant. It puts it in proportion. The Bible gives Christians solid reasons to believe that hostile spiritual beings are real. It gives clear examples of Jesus exercising authority over them. It gives warnings about spiritual deception and evil powers. What it does not give us is permission to fill every silence with a name, a rank, a specialty, or a diagnosis. So when Scripture is explicit, we can speak clearly. When the context strongly supports a conclusion, we can say so. When Christians reasonably disagree, we should say that too. And when a claim depends mainly on later tradition or speculation, we should not present it with the authority of the biblical text. That kind of restraint is not weakness in spiritual warfare. It is part of taking Scripture seriously. You do not need an exhaustive map of the unseen world in order to take evil seriously. And in Mark 5, the most certain truth is not how many categories of demons existed. It is who had authority when they met Jesus.